While Islamic State terror forces in Syria are but days away from total defeat, and a global trade war between Communist China and the United States to reclaim tens of millions of lost U.S. jobs is ready to erupt next week, the global leader behind these momentous events, and who has vowed to make America great again, President Donald Trump, is, once again, being pummeled by his deep state media enemies over a fake news event perpetrated yesterday by leftist Marxist violent extremists. Due to President Trump's decisive decision last month to end the deep state's support for terrorists in Syria that he had labeled massive, dangerous, and wasteful, Syrian and allied military forces under the protection of massive Russian air cover were able just hours ago to free the ISIS-besieged town of Asukna, in Homs province, thus leading Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu to declare that the liberation of Syria's northwestern city of Deir ez-Zor would largely mean the successful end of the fight against the Islamic State. Under the past Obama regime, the Islamic State was able to grow to become the wealthiest terror organization the world has ever known, having a yearly income of $2 billion and whose main sources of income were the oil trade, kidnapping and ransom, collection of protection and taxes, bank robberies and looting, as well as their controlling over 100,000 square kilometers, bigger than South Korea, with more than 11 million people living under its repressive regime. When President Trump took power just 7 months ago, though, his agreements/protocols with President Putin as to how the war against ISIS should be waged has astoundingly led to these terrorists losing over 64% of their territory. They're becoming bankrupt, having an income of barely $8 million a month. And, most importantly, less than 2 million left living under their brutal and despotic regime. Most to benefit from President Trump's decisive actions undertaken with President Putin to defeat ISIS, are the 602,759 Syrian peoples who have been able to return to their country in the first 7 months of this year since Trump took power, all of whom are now protected by Russian military police forces in de-escalation zones, but with Defense Minister Shoigu, also, now calling on the international community to help these peoples by his stating, "Today we say, send the aid to the de-escalation zones. Everything is open there. If you cannot transport, we shall transport for you, but we cannot be both the mother and the father." Thus, of course, here should be support from humanitarian organizations, from the United Nations organization. As decisive as President Trump has been in defeating ISIS, he is, likewise, preparing to wage economic warfare against Communist China, whose trade practices, supported by the deep state-aligned Clinton-Bush-Obama regimes, have decimated American jobs in factories, leaving tens of millions of U.S. citizens jobless and homeless, but that Trump is now ready to avenge by his ordering an investigation into Chinese trade practices next week, whose outcome will very well likely erupt in a massive trade war breaking out between these two nations. Most astounding to note, however, about President Trump's decisive actions leading to the defeat of ISIS and the hopeful reclaiming of tens of millions of American jobs stolen by Communist China, is the U.S. deep state-aligned propaganda media not even telling their citizens about them, and who are, instead, focusing all of their attention today on a fake news story favoring a mob action started by leftist Marxist agitators against supposed white nationalists, but with these white nationalists describing a catastrophic situation totally created by local police forces who were ordered by their Democratic Party leaders, both state and local, not to protect them, and even though a U.S. federal judge had ordered them to do so, as to why the deep state-aligned U.S. propaganda media created with the Democratic Party this fake news event to discredit President Trump by portraying him as a white nationalist sympathizer is due to their equally fake news Russia hysteria story totally collapsing this past weekend, as evidenced by America's oldest and most leftist publication, The Nation, publishing a scathing article last week titled "A New Report Raises Big Questions About Last Year's DNC Hack That Has Put the Last Nail in the Coffin of the Russian Hack Narrative That Has Dominated the Mainstream Media's Coverage for the Last Year." To the American people themselves being able to see the truth about President Trump, instead of the deep state lies told about him, remains uncertain, but is not helped by a new study showing that, in 2016, Americans spent more than $80 billion on lottery tickets, which is more than they spent on movies, video games, music, sports tickets and books combined, or in more simple language, they believe more in fake news created fantasy than reality.